Hey folks, Doug Blake with Body Design University. In this video, I want to talk to you about something that you may or may not think about. It's wrist position and gripping during your training. Now, obviously, we're talking about upper body movements, but something as simple as holding a bar while you're doing squats, maybe some other leg movements can possibly fit into this scenario as well. And the reason I'm going over with because I don't really hear it too often, but every once in a while I do get a question from a student, or in this case, somebody that was working out with another person, and they were doing, I think it was dumbbell curls, whatever, probably dumbbell curls, which is where this situation seems to find some issues and problems. And the question was, I'm training with this individual, and we're doing curls, and he felt it more in his wrist and his forearms than in his bicep. You ever have that issue, right? It's not uncommon. I've seen it any number of times when I've trained clients many years ago. It just depends on the individual, their sort of their ability to feel the muscle while they train. But in the case of wrist position, it just brings up some good points and some things to consider when it comes to proper exercise performance. And remember, the whole goal here when you're discussing or trying to determine the wrist position, how to position the wrist, thumbless grip, right? Because remember, this is not just about the position of the wrist while you're doing exercise, it's also the thumb. And really, there's two ways to do this, right? You can hold a dumbbell or barbell with a thumbless grip, right? You've seen that. So you put the thumb on the same side as the other four fingers, or you can take a thumbed grip, which is actually gripping and holding on to the dumbbell or the bar. And again, um, I've heard this any number of times where, like with dumbbell curls, an individual is training and they're using pretty significant weight. And when they put the bar down, they feel a lot of it's very tight in their forearm, right? And they don't feel it really in their bicep. I remember training a young kid many years ago. He could not get his wrist position right for whatever reason, from neuromuscular issues or whatever the case. He just simply could not get it with the dumbbell in a proper position to feel it in his biceps while he was doing dumbbell curls. Of course, that always leads to the question: exactly what should we be thinking about with wrist position and grip? And first and foremost, always, because we're using heavy, we're using loads that the body's not accustomed to, is safety, quote, and I put it in air quotes. What do we mean by safety? Well, if you're doing any particular exercise, upper body exercise, where you're holding dumbbells or a barbell, you've got to remember that the wrist, for the most part, is not one of the strongest anatomical structures in the human body. Okay. So you got to be very careful that you're not lifting loads or positioning your wrist in such a way that you cause issues or problems in the wrist itself. Now, I know you could potentially have potential issues with the flexor muscles of the forearm or the extensors of the forearm, but I don't really normally or have seen issues like that. The question, really, from a gripping standpoint and wrist position standpoint, has to do with literally that joint itself. And if you've ever done anything incorrectly while you're training, from dumbbell curls to pressing, any type of pressing movement, all you got to do is move it one way wrong, and you'll feel it, right? Issues related to carpal tunnel syndrome can also cause these problems. Power lifters, I have found, I had it myself, would often get numbness through the fingers, especially if you're wearing straps. I know probably a lot of you do this. You're doing deadlifts or you're doing different exercises, and you use straps around your wrist so that you can maintain a more stabilized or stronger grip, because the weight is literally too heavy for you to just hold with the power of your gripping strength. I'm not going to get into that. I don't generally recommend that the average person, again, athletes, you, the trainer, do what you're going to do. I can't tell you what to do, obviously, but I will tell you this: that when you're training people, this is the balancing act. Don't just have clients do what you do because that's the way you do it. Generally, clients are not using significant amounts of weights, and they should be using loads that they can actually hold and handle, right? Without using wrist straps, things like that. We used to call them props, right? Many, many years ago. If you can't hold it, it's too heavy for you. That was the thinking, right? From a powerlifting perspective, for sure. Okay, so back to the question at hand. Exactly how should you position your wrist? Well, look, the wrist is pretty dynamic joint. It allows for technically it allows for what's known as 2 degrees of freedom, meaning that it can move in different planes, basically two different planes. And at the wrist, you have flexion and extension, right? So if I go like this, right, flexion is forward this way and extension is back, right? So that's 1 degree of freedom. And then technically in the frontal plane, your wrist, now watch this, my wrist in the frontal plane can actually see what I'm doing. I'm moving it inward and then I can move it outward just a little bit. But this inward movement is one really critical component of the wrist, to be able to take your wrist and move it this way. Now, I know what some of you are saying. Well, what about rotation, supination, and pronation? Technically, that, I guess you could say, it occurs at the wrist, but the wrist itself is maintaining its position. It's really something that occurs more, not at the elbow, but in between. You could throw it in there as, okay, 3 degrees of freedom because I've got sagittal, frontal. Okay, I'll throw it in there as transverse plane of movement. Technically, when we're talking about the wrist itself, we're literally talking about the ability of the wrist, the ulnar and the radial radius bone, to provide joint motion, whereas with pronation and supination, technically, the bone that's moving, the radius, is doing motion around the radial ulnar component of the joint at the elbow. That's irrelevant, not that important to remember. It's these two movements, this flexion, extension, and technically, you could say adduction, abduction, if you wanted to look at it like that. But the wrist can move in the frontal plane, it can move in the sagittal plane. That's what you got to be thinking about. Now, here's where another little issue comes in, is that's the fingers. So gripping strength. So the flexion digital of the digits, so finger flexion, and the extension, so grabbing and holding. So there is an element here that you got to keep in mind when you're simply holding the dumbbell or the barbell. And of course, the first question, and this was one of the questions that this individual asked me: should I always do a thumbed grip or a thumbless grip? This is a personal preference safety issue. In other words, if you find that you feel the muscle that you're working more when you have a thumbless grip, I got that. There is an issue because a thumbless grip intrinsically is potentially more dangerous than a thumb over or a thumbed grip. Why? Obviously, I'm going to use a pen. Obviously, the bar or the dumbbell can fall out of my hand. Not good, right? Versus a thumbed grip, you can see I have my thumb over it now, provides a better position where it's not going to fall out. See the difference? So that versus that. Get it? I think that's pretty self-explanatory. On the other hand, personally, I always generally do a thumbless grip, only because I feel more comfortable in whatever exercises I'm doing. I generally, not all the time, because I can do it with a thumbed grip as well, like if I'm doing dumbbell curls, but depending on whether or not I am feeling it in the particular muscle. This comes back to, now when you're training somebody, what do you recommend? And for clients, I will always recommend a thumbed grip, simply because the safety potential being greater here, is always going to be paramount. I'm always going to put that first. Well, Doug, I don't feel it as much like this as when I do this. That's a decision I'm going to have to make with that particular client. Generally, the problem is not, look, if they ain't feeling it in their biceps when they do it like this, the reality is they're probably not going to feel a whole lot different here. Perhaps the weight's not heavy. I don't know. But what I will say is that for clients, for sure, do yourself a big favor. Go with a thumbed grip. As clients become more fit, they become more capable of dealing with resistance and heavier loads, then you may, being very cautious, then you may want to decide that you can go with a thumbless grip. Of course, the question is there really a difference? And the answer is, yeah, there is a difference, right? It's the biomechanics of having the thumb back behind this way actually puts the wrist into a somewhat, depending on the movement, a somewhat better position than having the thumb around like this. And you can see the difference here is that if I go with a thumbless grip, I essentially take out this large muscle right here that moves the thumb across the hand and the palm of the hand. Here, there is a potential issue with that, meaning I may actually feel more in my hand. And I've had clients tell me this all the time. I feel it more in my hand and my wrist than my bicep if I'm doing dumbbell curls. Well, in that case, you might want to have them do the one little trick that I've always had people do, and they tell me this, and I'm going to turn my hand to the side to show you, is that when I'm holding a dumbbell, is generally, depending on the exercise, particularly biceps, just so you know, is I will have them drop their wrist back slightly, just slightly. You may want to try that. By the way, do this on yourself first. If you're a trainer and you're actually training, do it on yourself first. Make sure you feel the difference. One of the key things about wrist position is that when you flex the wrist, when you pull up like on a dumbbell curl and you flex your wrist, do it yourself. Go ahead and literally flex it and try and pull it. Guess what's going to happen? You're going to feel it a whole lot more in your forearm flexors than you are in your bicep. So one of the tiny little tips or tricks is to do a slight drop back. Please don't do this. Okay, don't overdo it. I simply go from a neutral position and I just drop it back slightly. Sometimes the most subtle changes in the position of limbs and joints can make tremendous or feel tremendously different in the different muscles that you're training. So that's because biomechanics can be, in the field of biomechanics, we have very subtle differences and changes in angles and the way the limbs are positioned to satisfy the need to feel it in the target muscle that you're training. So in this case, biceps. So you may want to try it. The other thing to consider, so there's your wrist position. In some cases, you might want to drop it back slightly. Take the thumbed grip. That's what I would recommend. If you, as an experienced lifter, you want to go thumbless, that's on you. I know that's the way I like to do. I literally do feel it more. Like in my chest, if I do a thumbless press versus my thumbs over, again, simply because moving the thumb into a thumbed grip versus thumbless changes ever so slightly, changes the mechanics of how the wrist functions, right? Especially if you're doing pressing movements, something you have to try for yourself. Clients always go with the thumb grip just from a safety perspective. The other question that I get asked is if you're feeling it too much in the forearm flexors and dropping it back does not work, now what can you do? Not too many options on this, I'll be honest with you. This is where I will generally switch, if this is the case, from barbells to dumbbells, because now I have the pronation, supination option that I can now throw into the mix. And that might be as simple as you need to do to go from a dumbbell curl like this to a hammer curl. Okay. I know for me with elbow issues that I have, I've got can't dumbbell curls like this are really challenging because I do feel them in the extensions of my wrist of my forearm. And so if I literally pronate, right, go into a neutrally pronated position, that pain goes away. So yes, I did change the position of my wrist. So I've got this flexion extension. And I do have this rotational supination, pronation component that I can throw into it. Now, you heard me talk about how I can turn my wrist to the side like this, like this. Please, please do not throw that into the mix as an option. It is generally not going to have, and it's only going to cause problems. If you start holding things and pulling this way or this way, you will probably cause more problems than you're solving. So I would say, even though the wrist has that the opportunity to move in the frontal plane like this, that's probably not going to solve any issues from pressing and curling, things like that, even like tricep push downs. Again, generally, what I have found is that as soon as you take the wrist and drop it back slightly, there's the little kind of tip or trick, I guess you could say, that should take the stress and the feeling from the forearm. Of course, it could simply be that your client is simply gripping, trying to crush that weight, no matter how they do it. How do you deal with that? That is a trainer issue. That's a coaching issue. Relax, hold it. Don't grab it and don't try and squeeze and crush it. I've done that 1,000 times if I've done it once. And if I can get the client to go and relax, ooh, all of a sudden they start to feel it in the target muscle. Okay, so that's generally how I deal with issues related to hand and wrist. I hope this video was helpful. Please let us know by writing understand in the comments section below. If you have not done so, please subscribe to the channel. This is a relatively simple issue. And so if you have questions on it, please let us know. If you have any other ideas about how you deal with some of those particular issues related to the biomechanics, like you personally have found different tips and ideas to do that, please let us know in the comment section below. And just let us know how we can be of assistance. Have a great week. We will see you next week.